Welcome to We're the We and We the People. I'm Dr. Cynthia Newton, Chair of History, Politics, and Society and Associate Professor of Political Science at Wesley College in Dover, Delaware. I'll be hosting today's program. But before we begin, there are a couple of things I need to let you know about the League of Women Voters, which is the organization sponsoring this series. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. They do not support particular political candidates or political parties, but do take stands on certain issues. After providing countless voter registration sessions and informational programs to a wide swath of people, they discovered that most citizens don't really know a lot about how our government works at the federal, state, and even the local level. Some of you maybe have never had a basic civics class, or maybe you had one and you forgot some of the stuff along the way, even some of our league members. We hope this series will remedy that lack of information. This series is funded in part by a grant from Delaware Humanities. Today's segment is titled, A Look at Congress into the Bill to Law Process. Now this is a detailed and complex process, but I'm going to simplify it for you into a few key steps. I cannot stress the need for negotiation and compromise too much throughout this process, and I will mention it several times. As of late, these have somewhat become bad words in our political discourse, but they are essential for getting things done and trying to work with others. So I'm going to start us with the Constitution, looking a little bit at what is there and what the guidelines are, and then as we look into the Bill to Law process, the introduction process, a little bit on committee work, debate on the House floor, debate on the Senate floor, the process of voting and reconciling versions of bills, and then what happens when it goes to the president. Now, looking further at the Constitution, the process for making laws is in Article 1, which is the legislative section, Section 7. Now, the framers were deeply concerned about concentrating power in any one entity or person, and truly had a concern for checks and balances and input from multiple constituencies. And these things all show up in this process. Clause 1 in Section 7 does stipulate that all bills related to revenue, meaning things that bring money into the government, must begin in the House. This was because at the time, this was the only popularly elected branch and was considered close enough and most directly connected with the people. Clause 2 in Section 7 as well is called the Presentment Clause. And this says basically that both chambers have to pass any proposed piece of legislation. This is part of checks and balances. And then it goes to the president for action, either signing or rejection. We call it a veto, although the word veto is nowhere in the US Constitution. Now, each chamber develops its own processes and procedures. They are allowed to do this by the Constitution, things that suit their size, character, and leadership. So let's look at the actual process. So introducing a bill, and a bill is merely a proposed piece of legislation. It is not called a law until after it's passed, signed, and actually becomes something that people have to follow. Now, a bill can be drafted by anyone, you, me, any citizen, an interest group, a government agency, the president's office, even, again, obviously a legislator. And some bills have substance. They maybe address a major issue in American government, American society, think things like healthcare, immigration, etc., or maybe more symbolic in nature, maybe designating a particular day to a certain prominent individual, recognizing Women's History Month, maybe a particular disease, or like cancer, or focusing on things like autism. Now, in order for any bill to move forward, it does need to be sponsored by a member of Congress in either the House or the Senate, and actually introduced by them. It's good to have many sponsors because this obviously means you have more support, ideally some even from both of the two major political parties. So getting going into the process, there's an initial reading of the bill by the chamber leadership so that we all know what we're talking about, and assignment of a number for tracking and for the bill's individuality. It's given an HB number if it's in the House or an S number if it's in the Senate. And this is how you would find it if you were looking things up, historically. Then next it gets assigned to a committee. And this is a very political process and can be very contentious. It is determined by the leadership of the chamber and is affected by certainly the party in control, the leadership, and whether they think this is something they support or if they're hostile to the action. Now, all bills must go through both chambers, as I mentioned, and they can go one after the other or even concurrently. The only exception is, again, the revenue bills, which must start in the House. So moving into the committee work, this is where most of the heavy lifting, the big work on any proposed bill gets done. And it can include things like reviewing the legislation or the proposed legislation, marking it up, meaning making changes, adding amendments, holding hearings if they need more information or if it's a particularly contentious issue, having debate, etc. Most bills never make it out of committee and die there. This is because maybe the leadership in the committee or the party in the majority is opposed to it. The committee has a particularly heavy workload. We're near the end of the legislative session. The bill does not have a clear and compelling idea. It's too complex. Or that there's just an ultimate lack of negotiation and compromise to get the needed votes to move it along. Nonetheless, when the committee work is done, if they do finish it, the chair of the committee reports back to the chamber leadership and says, okay, we're ready to go, we're ready to bring it out on the floor. All bills in the House have an additional stop after their committee, and that's at the Rules Committee. This is, again, only a stop in the House, and this is where they assign guidelines for discussion and debate. The types of amendments that can be allowed, even whether amendments can be allowed at all. This is a practicality of such a large chamber, currently having 435 members. Having unlimited debate, discussion, adding of amendments would mean that nothing would ever progress. As we move into floor debate on the House, it's put on the calendar after the Rules Committee so that everyone knows when it's coming up. And then as it comes up, it's given a second reading by the leadership. This is because often what comes out of committee is significantly different, may not resemble what went in at all. Now, both chambers follow parliamentary procedure for debate, discussion, recognizing people, voting, etc. In the floor of the House, any amendments, if they are indeed allowed by the Rules Committee, must be germane, meaning that they actually must pertain to the proposed legislation at hand. This seems logical, yet this is not the case as we will see in the Senate. A couple of things about floor debate in the Senate. So there is no Rules Committee, so debate is open-ended. Any types of amendments can be added. They do not need to be germane. They may not even be at all remotely related to the piece of legislation being considered. Some legislators may even insert what's called a poison pill, something that makes the proposed piece of legislation so unpalatable that even its supporters are wary of voting for it. There are also a couple of procedural options on the floor of the Senate that do not exist in the House and are certainly worth mentioning. These come up because of the elite status of the Senate, at least how they see themselves and even how we as a country view them, and its smaller size of only having 100 members. They can have a lot more flexibility with their discussion and their debate. The first is the filibuster. You may have heard of this. This is where a senator, when they are recognized and given the floor, they talk nonstop, and they refuse to yield the floor. By parliamentary procedure, if you have the floor and you're recognized on the floor, it's yours until you give it up. There are certainly rules around what someone can and can't do during a filibuster. They can't leave the chamber, they can't stop talking, they can't lean on the podium, these sorts of things. But as long as they keep talking, they're good. A really good example of this comes from the late 1950s and former Senator Strom Thurmond. In 1957, he gave what many believe is one of the longest, if not the longest, filibuster on record. he spoke for over 24 hours to try to block a proposed piece of civil rights legislation. In that time, he read things like the Declaration of Independence, he read the voting laws of all 48 states, there were only 48 at the time, and just, again, kept talking. In the more modern era, filibusters are really more of a threat, although they do still happen. They are considered a tool of the party in the minority. This is their way, if they do not have enough votes to defeat a proposed piece of legislation, they can still affect its progress. Indeed, when someone is filibustering, the Senate and all of its business grinds to a screeching halt. So even though others may not like it, they still keep it because, again, it is a good tool of the minority. Another procedural element that's worth mentioning are votes of cloture. And basically, this is a vote to end debate. It's been around since 1917 and has needed a 3/5 majority since 1975. And again, votes of cloture are uncommon as no one really wants it used against them. No one likes a filibuster used against them either. But again, it can get business moving if the majority of the chamber agrees and it's just maybe one or two senators that are kind of holding up the show. So say the proposed piece of legislation, this bill, actually make it, it's made it this far, it's gotten through committee, it's gotten through debate on either the floor of the House or the Senate, and they're ready to actually vote. It's given a third reading by the chamber leadership, again because there may have been significant changes as amendments have been added, subtracted, language has been talked about and changed. And as we look at these types of voting procedures, they have increasing levels of accountability as one's name eventually gets recorded with their vote. So the first type of voting, and there are 4 types, is a simple voice vote. This is a yay and nay. It's uncontroversial. Obviously, individual members, their names are not attached to it. And it's usually for more symbolic actions or to a vote to adjourn, things, that aren't a big deal. The second type of voting is standing voting. This is, if you are in favor, you stand and they get counted, and then everyone opposed stands, gets counted. A little more accountability as you're actually seen standing up on one side or the other, but your name is still not recorded with your vote. The third type is teller voting. This is only an option in the House. And what happens is 2 tellers stand there and the members walk between them and they give their vote. Obviously, it's not heard by the rest of the chamber or the cameras from C-SPAN, but nonetheless, your vote is recorded with your name and can be looked up in the record. The fourth type, and arguably one of the more common, particularly when there are contentious issues at hand, is roll call voting. In the House, this is completely electronic. There's a big board up on the wall with everyone's name, and as they vote, lights near their name light up, depending on their vote. In the Senate, this is done kind of in an old-fashioned way, and the Senate likes this. They actually call out the names one by one, and senators say their vote. Obviously, whether it's electronic or by voice, calling the names, this is still the most accountable. Every representative or senator's name is recorded and associated with their vote. Everybody in the chamber can see and hear, and the cameras at C-SPAN can record it and broadcast it to everyone. One of the tactics that's often used in roll call voting is calling for repeat roll call votes. Obviously, particularly in the Senate, this can take time because you have to call 100 names. It's a way to stall to maybe get more support for one side or another or to shore up your votes. Members can request the various types of voting of the leadership depending on what is most relevant and appropriate for the legislation at hand. One more thing to point out is that in the Senate, there are often discussions of things like majorities and supermajorities, and this is often, a supermajority is 2/3 of all the members, so at this point 66, often referred to also as a 60-vote majority, and basically these ensure that there are enough votes to override a potential presidential veto, but also to fend off any significant opposition. It's also required for some types of votes in the Senate, and they have guidelines, sometimes written into the bills that also say this needs a majority, either 2/3 or 60 vote majority. Now, if different versions of a bill, as I mentioned, that they both have to go through both chambers, sometimes what comes out of the House and what comes out of the Senate, vastly different. And so only one version can go to the president's desk, so they'll need a conference committee. And this is a temporary committee of Congress that is made up of senators and representatives whose sole purpose is to work out the differences and come up with a final version. This is also another place where negotiation and compromise are key, because if they don't come up with a final version, the bill dies there. And again, it's gone through all this process. It may have taken months. It may have been tried several times over several years, and they don't want to have to start all over again. So coming up with a final draft, even if it's not ideal, is better than starting over. And then once they've come up with a final version, the conference committee disbands, and both chambers have to approve this final version. And again, they generally do, because it's better than having nothing. The next step, and kind of almost the final step in the process, is that it goes to the president's desk. This again is part of the checks and balances. Now the president can sign it, and it becomes a law. And sometimes if it's a big deal or significant piece of legislation or something that the president is very proud of, there'll be a big signing ceremony, and they'll have people that were supporters, and they'll have multiple pens, and people will get souvenirs of pens after it's over. Sometimes it's just done quietly and signed and becomes law. But the president can also veto something. This means to reject it and not sign it. If the president vetoes it, it goes back to Congress. Now, both chambers must pass with a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. So typically, Congress does not send something to the president's desk if the president has indicated that they will veto it, unless either that Congress has enough votes to override in both chambers, or they want to send a message to the president or make a point to the American people that the president is not working with them or does not support this particular issue. The third type of action the president can take or not take is what's called a pocket veto. Now this is where they don't sign it, they don't outright veto it, essentially they do nothing, they just set it aside. If Congress is in session, this bill becomes a law in 10 days. If Congress is not in session or goes out of session at any point during those 10 days, the bill dies. This timing is strategic, certainly on the part of Congress, but also on the part of the president. This lets a president to not be seen as actively supporting something and having their name associated with it, but not being so opposed to it that they're willing to veto it. So they just kind of put it aside and it quietly becomes a law. Now, again, these are the basic steps in the process, and you could spend quite a long time reading about, researching all the detail, the nuance, the politics, the procedures, but at least these basic steps kind of give you an idea of what's going on. And this process all along the way, in addition to being influenced certainly by the members of Congress, the House and the Senate, and the president, but also by the two major political parties, by major interest groups, wealthy corporations, individuals, the voices of citizens. A lot of other pressures come to bear on this process and how fast or slow something goes through it. This is an important process for citizens to understand, certainly because of the accountability as they vote for the members of Congress, but also avoiding misconceptions, things like saying that Congress gets nothing done. If you look in more detail at this process, it's surprising that really anything gets through this process at all. It's important for this process to be slow, and indeed the framers designed it as such, so that it is deliberative, takes time, hear all voices, and that those in the opposition have time to be heard and can affect the process, and possibly the content. Mistakes can be addressed, and things would not cause larger problems down the road. So hopefully, again, this gave you a little more insight in the bill to law process. Thank you very much for your time.